Well, this is going to be very informal, I think, and friendly, so I'll start. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight to act as a facilitator for this event. Tom Garvin is one of the great friends of my life. He's somebody we've been together since first arts, and he certainly has enriched my life. And Bryan, I know, is a colleague in UCD, where he's somebody who takes his vocation as an academic very seriously and very committed to the highest academic values. Now, the key word in this book tonight is define. It isn't the 30 best books, the 30 most popular books. I thought the Irish Times missed the point completely last week in writing about this, where it produced a sort of a 7 or 8 other books that they maybe thought should have been there. But this is the word define, defines Ireland. And I'm looking forward to Tom and Bryan maybe elaborating a little bit further on that. Now, this book is obviously a labour of love for the two authors. It's the product of a lifetime of very serious reading and a great deal of reflection and a great deal of airtime in the UCD common room, where anybody who was within earshot was invited to share in the passion and the enthusiasm of our two heroes here. So what I'm going to do very simply is ask Tom and then Bryan to maybe talk for a couple of minutes about their thinking behind this book, the word define and anything else they want to say, and then we open it up to the floor. So Tom.
Right. Thank you very much, Maurice. This book came about, as many books do, in the common room in UCD. And Bryan and myself were arguing, if that's the word, for several years about merits or demerits of history books, books on social life, books on Irish politics, going back over the last 350 years. Ever since the Irish learned English, the English regretted teaching us English, because we've never shut up. We've been talking ever since. We've been arguing. The original draft title of this book was Irish Argument. The arguments the Irish have been having for the last 3.5 centuries or 4 centuries as to who was Irish and who wasn't. Should Ireland be a republic, or should it be run by an aristocracy? Should it be a kingdom, or should it be some kind of a democracy? Should Irish people be educated, or should they be trained? Education is a very dangerous thing, after all, and a lot of people in Ireland seem not to like education very much, as distinct from training. And that particular hare has been up and running again over the last 10 or 15 years and thereabouts. So that was certainly my take on it anyway. I can't really talk for Bryan. I just thought that these arguments pop up again and again and again in every generation, and people think they are making a new argument about some new topic, but in fact they are repeating something that was said a generation previously, or 2 generations previously, or even several centuries previously. That was my take on it anyway, the extraordinary continuity of Irish concerns over several centuries. So I started off with Geoffrey Keating, Foras, Feasa, Eirinn, which is an extraordinary kind of pseudo-history of Ireland, saying that the ancient Gaels of Ireland were wonderful people, and that they came into Ireland after the flood from Scythia and all this sort of thing, and they were terribly noble, and they were known internationally as wonderful warriors, kind to orphans, great talkers, and everything else. And the English, of course, when they came in, started to denigrate the Irish by looking at the worst among the Irish and generalising to the entire population from the thieves and beggars and vagabonds of Ireland, as though no other country had thieves, beggars and vagabonds. And this goes on through Jonathan Swift, who, of course, famously thought the Irish might as well eat their children, they'd be better off, and the babies would be better off for not surviving. Patrick Sheehan was an extraordinary priest in Doneraile, County Cork. He turned out huge, long, nowadays rather boring novels, I suppose, but at that time fascinating. And he was the most popular Catholic novelist in the Irish world, in Ireland, in Irish America, and among the Irish in Britain. And suddenly around 1960, he was forgotten. Now it's as though somehow or other James Bond was forgotten about all of a sudden. Something big happened in Ireland around 1960, huge cultural switch, and Sheehan became redundant, and he has been forgotten about. I don't know how many of you here have heard of Canon Sheehan, and have you read much of him? I doubt if you have, because I had to read him for my sins only a few years ago for lecturing purposes. Feasa Hegarty's Victory of Sinn Féin is the story of the treaty split from the inside by a man who knew the principals, the leaders of that time quite intimately. Feasa Hegarty was a Cork man. In fact, Corkmen pop up all over the place throughout the centuries, which is quite extraordinary. In fact, so much so that I tried to turn a Tipperary man into a Corkman by accident at one stage in my writings here. Frank O'Connor is the best Irish short story writer of the 20th century, but that's not why he's in. He's in there because of a particular story or group of stories about the Irish Civil War, Guest of the Nation. And it is the most eloquent description of the folly of warfare, and particularly a war in which you end up killing your friends. And you spend the rest of your life trying to forgive yourself for something that you had to do or felt you had to do at that time. Sean O'Faolain is the rehabilitator of Daniel O'Connell, the liberator, after two generations of Republican and Mitchellite vilification. Todd Andrews, I put in here, Dublin made me because I knew him reasonably well. He was a family friend, and I thought that my specialised knowledge of Todd Andrews would be worth giving him a slot. Also, he was a very important figure, and in many ways he was the type of a certain kind of revolutionary turned civil servant who was very important in Ireland historically during the first generation after independence. And that sort of wipes me out. I think I'll hand over to Bryan now.
Yeah, I mean, the books that define Ireland, we struggled with titles. They are not the books that shaped Ireland, but nor are they the books that are the best known Irish books or the books that exemplify Irishness to the world. I mean, those books are James Joyce. Those are the great novels for the most part. We have a few novels here, we have short stories and pamphlets, but they're there really for their societal context and for the fact that they reflected their times. Tom and I, in our own way, are social scientists. We're not literary critics, we're not literary theorists. We don't have a dog in that particular race. So in a sense, perhaps, our book is different than most things that come out on Irish literature in the sense that we're arguing the case for non-fiction. I mean, Tom's first book was Keating's For a Feasa or Eirinn, which kind of invents, if you will, a kind of nationalist historiography. My first contribution to this volume, we wrote half them each, is Molyneux's pamphlet, The Case for Ireland, which appears at the end of the 18th century and is the template for Grattan's Parliament 80 years later, in the sense that it makes a case for a Protestant patriot Parliament, you know, independent up to a point from England and so on. And these are the themes also of Jonathan Swift in all his writings in the 1720s and all those wonderful pamphlets about the corruption of Ireland and the unfairness of taxes and the unfairnesses of currency policy, things that resonate even to this day. And then his great satire at the end of that decade on eating babies, The Modest Proposal. So Swift and Molyneux are the figures who are, if you will, iconic for the Protestant patriots who, like Grattan. And when Grattan establishes his parliament in Dublin, he is supposed to have said spirit of Swift, spirit of Molyneux. Now it's not quite clear whether he said it on the day or whether he corrected the minutes later on, but in general it's taken that he said that. So moving on from there, we're left with the other great movements that have shaped Ireland, and what kind of books exemplify those? We have included Wolfe Tone here. Wolfe Tone's autobiography didn't appear till almost 3 decades after his death. It was put together by his son. It is one of the most fascinating books ever created, and I urge you to go out and read it at some stage during your life. It's not just Wolfe Tone's biography in itself. It contains also, in the very first edition and then after, the biography of his son who collected this memoir. And the son grew up in France and entered into Napoleon's army as a hussar and fought in many battles. And how he got into that army and how he got his commission is described in the third memoir by Wolfe Tone's widow, who was left with the family in France after the failed 1798 rebellion, trying to do what a lot of women have to do, which is mind the kids and bring up the family. So she basically stops Napoleon as he's bringing his entourage across the park, and she describes this beautifully, and then gets her son a commission. Then in the 1820s they moved to America, mother and son, and it is there that the Wolfe Tone's autobiography is put together for the first time. But it's not until the 20th century that the full version comes out, because the son left out bits of his father's autobiography. He left out the bits where his father, Wolfe Tone, talked about his passion for the opposite sex, often in some considerable detail. And there's a sort of a picture of Wolfe Tone that emerges like a character in a Thackeray novel, like Barry Lyndon in a sense, who makes his way through that century trying to advance himself and trying to improve himself. But his turn towards patriotism and republicanism come very late in the day for him. He tries to enlist in the East India Company and he's not let in. He tries to make his fortune as a lawyer on the Munster circuit, and that doesn't work out for him. And eventually he finds his feet in politics, but then becomes genuinely absorbed in republicanism and the ideals of it. But as he says himself, he knows no Catholics, has barely ever spoken to one in his life, wouldn't know what to say to one if he met one. He was sure they'd be pretty boring people. So he's not quite the icon held up by Patrick Pearse, another person in our book. Pearse basically draws very heavily on figures such as Wolfe Tone, and indeed there's a band called the Wolfe Tones who have an album called A Tribute to Patrick Pearse. And Patrick Pearse's oratory, you know, at Wolfe Tone's grave is often the centre stage of an awful lot of Irish republicanisms. But these are often very far from Wolfe Tone. But Pearse himself is also important, as is Connolly, as is John Mitchel in particular. And these nationalist writers are in many ways brilliant writers who live brilliant and fascinating lives, and they deserve to be any book that define Ireland. Mitchel, for me, was a revelation. I mean, he is basically a figure who is a journalist and a writer in the run-up and through the famine. He deliberately gets himself incarcerated as a revolutionary to become a kind of a martyr. He is shipped, then he's transplanted to the other side of the world. He makes his escape to America. He becomes a hero of his time. He's also a fan of the slave-owning South. He writes of the great meeting on the Hill of Tara by his nemesis Daniel O'Connell, who he never ever takes the opportunity not to put down. His great achievement perhaps is the destruction for several decades of O'Connell's reputation. Yeah. But the only Hill of Tara he was really interested in was perhaps the Tara of Gone with the Wind. I mean, he's very much a figure who, if you will, of the Irish people who populate that one. So in essence, basically, he also believes that slavery is not a bad thing when compared to the liberalism which has destroyed Ireland. He writes another book called The Last Conquest of Ireland, where the great enemy is liberalism, which is destroying old ways of life and is replacing them with a liberal political economy. And there are people to this day who echo this one. And in a sense, basically, Mitchell's anti-liberalism, even though it's rooted in a deep conservatism, shapes an awful lot of Irish thought into the 20th century, not least James Connolly, not least again republicanism, not least again Irish anti-neoliberals and so on and so forth. As we move into the 20th century, clearly we have to deal with Catholicism. But the first book we have in our sequence of books that address Catholicism is the what you call it? Oh my God, I'm stuck here for a second.
Blanchard?
No, it's not the Blanchard at all. The Catechism. Pardon me, it slipped my mind. But the Catechism is important to Catholics in the way perhaps that the King James Bible is important to Englishness, not just because the King James Bible is one of the great books that's set along Shakespeare, the English language, but in the Irish case, Catholics don't read the Bible. They're instructed not to do so. And in our essay on catechisms and the history of the use of catechisms, we draw on research in the early 19th century which cites the libraries of different hedge schools, and where the priest is going around making sure that the Douay Bible, which is the authorised Catholic Bible, isn't used, but that the catechism is used instead. For in Catholicism, it is the priests who instruct the laity on the faith. We have other books then that are about the critiques of Catholicism in the 20th century, and then of course we move to the more recent decades where we're engaging with perhaps what people think are the hypocrisies to do with Catholicism, such as clerical abuse. When we move to the 20th century, just bear with me a second, there are lots of other things in this book anyway, but basically the last number of books in our volume address the crises of the last number of decades. And a lot of these have to do with sexuality and trust and what you might call moral authority, and the idea of morality having something to do with sexuality, but not necessarily to do with other forms of public morality. And I think these things are brought out in the last book in our collection, which is a very recent book, just published 2 years ago, by Elaine Byrne, which is basically called A Crooked Harp. And it's basically a history, the first ever academic history on political corruption in Ireland. It took 2012 for that to happen, which is amazing if you think about it. So what we think we do now is perhaps open it up a little bit.
Thanks very much, Brian. And I think after what we've heard, I think you can see why I enjoy the book so much. And it's a book you can pick up, put down, keep coming back to. And it's a good bedside book as well. Anybody like to ask a question or make a comment or an observation?
Or a criticism.
Oh, indeed. Yes.
I have three questions. I'll run them together if you don't mind. One is, if the two professors wouldn't mind saying how hard it was to make the selection, what to leave out, and whether or not they had any disagreements. And one smaller one, why it swim two birds and not on bail booked? And thirdly, the nation changes, so the definition of the nation changes. So if we were to speculate on what we might do if we started the same project in 40 years' time, what would be left off the list, and what books already published might be on it?
Well, these are very good questions, and they are hard questions. Well, the first thing is we started this gently. We had no sense we were writing a book, but merely talking. And then the talks began to have a bit of structure, mostly over lunch. And we at one stage then agreed to go off and write a list each. So we wrote a list each, and we agreed on some ground rules, which of course we then broke. The ground rules were basically that the book should be, if possible, non-fictions, that they should be, if possible, reflecting the times in which they were written. In other words, not later retrospective looks, like, a history of the 18th century written, say, 5 years ago. Even though that might be a game changer, it doesn't really, in a sense, reflect the sensibilities of that time, perhaps, as well as those first drafts of history written at the time. So we had some overlaps, and then we had to plug some gaps. We had a number of overlaps, and we just wrote some essays tentatively, and then set ourselves off on further courses of reading. And we also asked anybody, man, woman, child, anybody who would talk to us, what else we might put in there. And we gradually got there. And I think it's not really a scientific exercise after a certain point, but we managed to impose some kind of structure on it. We were also kind of keen that, if you will, the books would, if you would pick up after each other. There was a lot of interleaving, even though the essays are all self-standing. There is interleaving between them. There are certain things that arise in several essays because of certain passions of ours. One of them is Brian Merriman's poem Court na Man Ihe, The Midnight Court, which is mentioned by Edna O'Brien in quite a lot, and as one of her characters talk about it in one of her first novels. It is basically put into translation by Frank O'Connor, and it stands an opposite to the kind of Irish language poetry promoted by Daniel Corkery, who was the great post-independence, conservative, Catholic, isolationist intellectual who, with his Hidden Ireland, pretty much defined that mainstream agenda for some decades as well. So his notion of what constituted the classics of Irish poetry in the Munster tradition excluded Brian Merriman. So there were all sorts of backs and forths, and we tried not too hard to make it too complicated, but to really find things then that we could do together. And then, like all good small children, we played alongside each other well rather than play together at times. In other words, I would write a piece and Tom would write a piece, and then we would share them with each other, but not necessarily rewrite them together, but basically talk about them and then rework them perhaps individually.
Could I cut in? One of the ideas we had, at least I had anyway, was that these titles would be headline titles, really, rather than the theme of the whole essay. So the Swim to Birds chapter actually includes On Bail Boat, and it includes The Third Policeman, and it includes back references to the books that lie behind Miles's great writings of the 1940s. And the books that lie behind it are actually the books of the great Blasket, On Talánach and Fifth Bleeding Foss, in particular those two. The Nightmare Bicycle in The Third Policeman, for example, is a nightmare bicycle straight from 20 years of growing. The same nightmare. It's quite extraordinary. When I reread the book, I said, good God, this is where Miles got it. And On Talánach, the Bail Book is actually in many ways a parody, and a rather unfair parody of On Talánach, because whatever else you might say about O'Croghan, he was a brave man. He was a highly intelligent man. He was a man who learned to read from the missionaries in the 1850s, I think, on the Great Blasket. And he tried to write in Irish because his English was very weak. And he wrote down in phonetic English some oral poetry from some of the old Shanachies on the island. And later on, I think it was a man called Kelly from Tralee, taught him how to write Irish taught him the spellings and the ellipsis and the bulches and all the rest of it. And he learned modern Irish orthography in about 10 minutes, or in about 6 months or something like that. And then he started writing on Tulana, and he wrote it chapter by chapter by chapter, and sent each chapter off to Kelly in Tralee, I think it was, who put it together and edited it. And it's an amazing book. It is, it is easily the greatest book written in Irish in the 20th century, I would say. And it is one of the great Irish books of the 20th century. Even in translation, and I see great pleasure. It's just been retranslated with the rude bits put back in by two modern scholars. But the other chapters are the same. There's one headline. For example, I have a whole set of books on Irish culture and development, and I start off with Plunkett's argument that the Irish Catholicism was hostile to economic development. And then there's a rebuttal by a priest called Eirinn a couple of years later, and they seem to be arguing about Max Weber's idea of the Protestant ethic and spirit of Catholicism. But they couldn't have read Max Weber's book because the chronology is wrong. So those ideas must have been in the air at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. The idea that Catholicism somehow is bad for economics and Protestantism is good for economics. It was there before Max Weber wrote his famous book. So I put Max Weber into the chapter as well as a connection. And that's the way I try to work anyway. I think Bryan did more or less the same thing. I try to put in connected books and give them brief reviews or mentions as well. That's the whole idea.
To your question, what the books that didn't make it, the books that...
oh yeah.
I mean, the book I wanted most to put into it, and it was mostly because perhaps that part of the century was getting rather cluttered up, was a Bungalow Bliss. Bungalow Bliss is a book of plans that was published some decades ago and sold, I believe, hundreds of thousands of copies. And essentially it was a simple plan for building a simple bungalow, and it allowed you to do so with a small builder to do this without an architect. And this has perhaps more than anything else defined much of the Irish landscape over the last several decades. So in other words, thinking outside the box, it would have been good to have something like that there, which in a sense is also the reason why the Catechism chapter is there, because the Catechism itself is not a particular work of literature. There are many catechisms. In a sense, the Catechism was like the frequently asked questions that you find on websites. You know, there are questions and stock answers. And stock answers vary according to the Catechism a little bit, depending on the audience. So there are things that like that we could have always put in. There are an awful lot of books, for example, on the current crisis and on the recent crisis and on the bringing into light of sexual abuse in Ireland. Yeah. There are many such wonderful books, whether it's Mannix Flynn or anybody else. But the one we went with was Mary Raftery and Ono Sullivan's book, Suffer the Little Children. Because I think, in a way, the argument of that book was the most comprehensive. It didn't just look at clerical abuse in its own right, but located it into who knew what, and in particular into the role of the state in this, and in particular the role of the Department of Education over several decades. And it really was a book not just about exposing clerical abuse, but about the entire system that ran from 1868 up until 1970, when Artane was closed down or thereabouts, within which basically Irish children, hundreds of thousands of them, were put into, for many reasons, but also because there was not a social welfare net. Children were put into those homes when there was absolute poverty, because there was no other way of doing so. By 1918, England had stopped using homes for those purposes, mostly because the welfare safety nets were getting better. So the idea of helping a very poor child where poverty was the main problem could be done in the home and in the family. But the Irish system of the industrial schools and the Magdalen laundries is a failure of the Irish state and the Irish polity, and not just a failure of the church, in my view. So I figured that was one that captured the wider argument. But like Tom, I located that alongside the other books in the genre as well. So,
and the one that didn't make it for you?
Emer O'Duffy, forgotten Irish humorist of the 1920s and 1930s. He was a kind of predecessor to Miles, and he wrote a book called Asses and Clover, which still reads very, very well. It's a kind of parody of Irish independence and the corrupt and crooked politicians and the idiotic things they get up to. And at one stage he has the Irish Republic in the future, in the early 21st century, where Sir Seamus van der Baggs, who's obviously a De Valera figure, gets up on the Dáil and demands that Ireland be allowed to exercise its right to be part of the United Kingdom. due to its glorious history as part of the United Kingdom, which is being forgotten by the young of Ireland today. The British Army invades Ireland and re-establishes the Irish Republic by force. But he didn't quite make it, because I think Miles overshadowed him a bit, you know. And as you say, that part of the century is getting a bit cluttered, because there were a lot of very good writers in Ireland at that time.
Yeah. James Joyce as well. We don't have James Joyce.
Yeah.
And there's perhaps two reasons. Is that everybody does James Joyce. And if you want to read a book about James Joyce, chances are you've got several on your shelf.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that James Joyce is perhaps most important in influencing Irish society for Bloomsday more so than almost anything else. Because he wasn't a writer that seriously influenced Irish writing in his own way. It wasn't until the 1950s that he found an audience in Ireland. That was a rather small, elitist one. And they wrote very different kinds of books. He was writing from the outside. He's a great world writer. He's our greatest writer, in my view. But it's not a book that defines Ireland in the way perhaps that some of the books that we talk about, such as the Canon Sheehan novels that were read by everybody, that described an Ireland that was basically turning towards the revolutionary nationalism and very much going through that sort of the Irish revival, the post-Fenian mood. And he was really describing the kind of world that created people like Pearse. And I think in a sense, basically, Canon Sheehan captures something that is more sociological in a sense. I mean, everybody describes James Joyce as a great ethnographer because he recreates Dublin. But the question is, does he really recreate Dublin, or is it Trieste he recreates? I mean, the Jewish community in Dublin, as described by him, don't really relate to the Jewish community perhaps described by Cormac O'Grada in Jews in the Age of Joyce, which describes the real Litvak and Lithuanian Jewish community, which are very different. They wouldn't have had a Bloom. His father would not have owned the Queen's Hotel in Ennis, much in order that pleased me because I come from Ennis and went to dances in the Queen's Hotel all through my teenage years, imagining that perhaps somewhere Leopold Bloom and his dad were involved in the running of that rather disreputable venue. Yeah, so there it is.
Okay, you haven't answered the third part, but we'll move on there for a second, because just to see if somebody else would care to, but you've done very well on the 2 bits. Somebody at the back there. But then we go to the third part of your question. Could you, somebody else?
What was the third part?
How would the book be different if started in 40 years? What might be in?
I'm not a prophet. I really don't know. I just hope that other books like this will be written. And I, in fact, have been challenged to supply 30 titles for another book like this. And I only got to about 10 or 15 and then stopped. So, you know, let the future look after the future, I'm afraid. I just can't answer that question.
I'm a social scientist, and my day job essentially is writing about how immigration is transforming Ireland. And that is the main area of my academic research. Yeah. So I look around and I see that Ireland is now 1 in 8 made up of migrants. I see them making huge contributions to Irish society. I see that huge amounts are not known perhaps about how they're transforming our communities, but clearly they're involved with and transforming ever so many of our communities. I'm beginning to see the glimmerings of literature there. I'm aware of all the research that's emerging. And the kinds of books I'd like to see would be books that reflect, if you will, these changes in Ireland, most of them which are very positive changes in the context where we're used to being very perhaps narcissistic in thinking about ourselves as Irish, with things such as The Gathering, where we imagine ourselves in communion, mostly for economic reasons, with the diasporan Irish, many of whom perhaps don't quite know that they're Irish, but nevertheless are like Barack Obama, get alerted to the fact every so often. At the same time, there must be rethinking about what it means to be Irish in the 21st century. And I think if writers can rise to that challenge, they'd be the kinds of books I'd love to see, reflected down the line in any such collection.
One thing I forgot to mention is that we tried to give Unionism its day, if you like. Well, before 1922 and all that, before the setting up of Northern Ireland, we had quite a few unionists of one kind or another. I mean, Swift would have been a unionist. They all would have been unionists, really. The idea of partition only really starts to arise when Ireland democratises. And that's around 1886 or thereabouts, when something close to manhood suffrage was finally achieved. And Ireland split into orange and green immediately. 5 or 6 orange counties and 26 or 27 green counties, if you like. So Northern Ireland has only been around for 90 years, whereas the book is dealing with an Ireland that has been around for 400 years. And therefore, there was a complaint from somebody in the BBC Belfast that we weren't giving Northern Ireland a fair shake, etc., 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 because he had only 3 or 4 clear books about Northern Ireland. And one was Conor Cruise O'Brien's States of Ireland, and another one was A.T.Q. Stewart's
Narrow Ground.
The Narrow Ground, which I believe to be the best short analysis of the Ulster situation, or problem, whatever you want to call it, ever written. It's terrific. It's only 150 pages, and I would suggest that, having bought this book and read it from cover to cover, you go off and get The Narrow Ground. It's a terrific book. He wrote it, as he says himself, when he had whatever we call the opposite to writer's block. It poured out of him. And when I read it the same way. I was about 1978. I'm a Dubliner of nationalist tradition and all the rest of it. Here I was seeing Ireland from a unionist viewpoint by an honest Ulsterman, Tony Stewart, who I got to know later on, a lovely man, and he was seeing Ireland as a big green island upside down, where a big green blob was coming down towards Belfast. And this is the way people under siege see their enemies. And that was the basic problem. This had to be managed, and it had to be managed by constitutional means, not by fighting or not by arguing for rights or wrongs on either side. But we have to set up a constitution for Ireland that has a place for Northern Ireland. That's what he said. And something like it was the book that was issued to all the Good Friday Agreement people. That and John White's Understanding Northern Ireland, those 2 books.
The Great Hunger, Tom, Cecil William Smith. And
Yes.
when we were students, that was being debunked by historians as bad history. Why do you think it defined?
First of all, it was written by an English woman. And secondly, it is cast a very cold eye on the British government at that time. And as she says herself, very interestingly, she wrote the book when the Irish are just beginning to forgive the English for the Great Catastrophe, and to accept the proposition that it wasn't just a great crime, but at least was in part a natural disaster. So she came to Ireland, and as she says herself, Robin Dudley Edwards and all the other historians were very generous to her and helped her. First of all, of course, by giving her their notes from their own book, the Great Famine book, published a little bit previously, and were enormously hospitable and all the rest of it to her. No hostility, nothing like that. She liked Ireland very much. I think she liked the Irish very much, and I think that's one of the reasons I picked it. The impact of that book was huge, and she was a very well-known historian in England as well as in Ireland. She was a historian of Victorian policy makers. Sure. An earlier book was the Great Mistake of the Crimean War. Why they fought the war in Crimea, why they were so badly prepared, why they had such incompetent generals, and all the rest of it. So her Irish book was able to ride on the coattails of the previous book in England. And that was a huge impact there, as well as, of course, a huge impact in Ireland.
Talking about Geoffrey William Smith's history, I thought you previously said that you weren't looking at books that looked at historical subjects, but rather books that were dealing with the...
But you didn't hear us say we made our own rules and then we occasionally broke them because we're only human. That's one part of the answer.
You do open it up.
Yeah.
And then there are a huge range of books that are about the history of Ireland that have been very influential.
Yeah. I think
there's been a flood since about 1960. The Irish publishing industry, as use Bryan's phrase, has been going through a kind of golden age over the last 40 years or thereabouts. In the 1950s, I don't think any history books were published in Ireland. Maybe one, the Last Invasion of Ireland, Richard Hayes. That's about the only one I can think of. But now it's hundreds. There are hundreds of them every year, and certainly my poor old eyes can't cope with them anymore. Yeah. So I delegate that to other people nowadays. Yeah. But I think it's wonderful to see it happen, to see that history, politics, sociology, all social sciences have exploded in this country in a way that wasn't possible in the 1950s, wasn't imaginable even in the 1960s. And of course that's due to Don O'Malley and free education and all the rest of it. Maybe I should have put him in.
Yeah. That'd be a different book.
That'd be a different book.
Yeah. But the people who define it.
I mean, there are a number of academic books written on how history itself and how Irish history is being told shifts over time. And of course, within all of that, there are political and ideological battles that take place. But in a sense, this book is one that comes in from the outside and has a considerable influence. And perhaps we broke our own rules there, but we don't regret that we put it in, I guess, because there's another thing I guess we should say is that this book is also about our enthusiasms. And we put in books that we want people to read. And in the guess, basically, anybody compiling a book like ours would come up with a different selection, I would imagine. Yeah. You know, we say these are books that define Ireland, they're books that define Ireland. You could add a few, take away a few. We would argue that most of them are on the money, and most of them warrant more reading and being taken more seriously and warrant thinking about. But mostly, we commend you to go out and buy and read some of these books, or go and download some of them for free, which is very possible with the older ones. Not that we should be saying that in Hodges Figgis. But nevertheless, they're books worth reading, because they do say something. And I think the bigger angle of the book is that it comes at it mostly in terms of the social impact. And in a sense, basically, that book on the famine had a social impact because of the huge popular reception it had. And we were now at a situation where we have famine ships, and we basically, you know, we celebrate the famine in a sense, which is kind of an odd proposition to think about. But that kind of begins in that kind of era, back from those times, not earlier in a sense.
Anybody else? Okay, would you like to add anything, Bryan? I think we've pretty much covered all the ground. I mean, I think perhaps one book I would like to mention to finish up for me is a book by a guy called Paul Blanchard called The Irish and Catholic Power, which comes out in the 50s. And it's basically this guy who starts off as a sort of a kind of a public attorney in New York. And he's into gang busting, and he's studying Irish political corruption. And then he basically writes a book around the time when Kennedy's rising to prominence about how the Catholics are dangerous politically to the idea of democracy in America, in a sense that we would now talk about Muslims as being dangerous to the idea of democracy because of their belief in clerical power and the role of the church. And then he comes to Ireland, where this is all happening, where the church seems to have this huge influence on politics and society. And he does this analysis of Irish society. But one of the things he looks at is the role of Catholics in informing public morality. And he talks about sexual morality, and he talks about how there's a blind spot around political morality and a lot of the things that we're finding now that has become part of, if you will, the Irish scene. The book is not well received, not least because it has a foreword by a unionist using it as to say this is a great book to bash Ireland with, in a sense. It's a very, if you will, an introduction that is hostile to the idea of the Irish Free State and Republic. But nevertheless, it's a book that in time seems, even though it is written almost from an anti-Irish tilt, is hugely influential in terms of people like John White coming later and naming some of the things that are in that book about, say, the role of the church in politics and so on and so forth. And then revisiting this book after many, many decades, when we start thinking about the more recent years and the role of Catholicism and the issues of sexual abuse, and perhaps the way that Catholicism has sociologically influenced us as a people, and what we think is moral and not moral, how we are worried about sexual morality but nevertheless not worried about trust, not worried about political accountability as forms of public morality. And he's really, really good on some of these things. So he's really this guy from the outside bringing some bad news. He's not wrapping it up in an attractive package. He's using it for his own agenda, but at the same time he's on the money in many ways. And it's a book that behind the scenes influences, I think, an awful lot of writing about Ireland that comes true, especially academia in the last number of decades. So that would be one of my choices for a book that warrants basically being put back into the canon, in a sense, of serious books about Ireland. When you say behind the scenes, that was a banned book when I was an undergraduate. And
that's right.
To get it one had to get special permission from the librarian. I
UCD.
was very disappointed.
No. It was librarian had it locked up. It wasn't banned or anything like that.
Was it?
John White was bemused when I said I'd like to read Blanchard's Irish and Catholic Power, and he said, "Haven't you read it already?" And I said, "Well, the librarian won't allow me have the college copy." And I write you a note.
That's it.
He is to read it, and so I handed it in and got a copy of the book and read it. And now I have my own copy, and on the fly leaf of the second-hand copy, 1954 or thereabouts, is written, "Ireland as others see us." Whoever it was.
One I was surprised you included was the Kerry babies. Maybe you might finish off by saying that was yours, Brian.
It has to be in there.
Yeah.
I mean, the early 80s saw all sorts of incredible things happen. We had statues that moved, we had the Kerry babies, we had
weird.
lots of other things happening. And it was a time perhaps when our ordinary Ireland was going through a sea change of thinking about an awful lot of things. But the Kerry babies scandal, you know, how that woman was treated by the police and so on, was exposed by Nell McCafferty in a polemic, written along the style of her court report, and Vincent Browne and others. And there were lots of articles at the time, but there's something about Nell McCafferty's polemic that, you know, has the quality of Jonathan Swift. It opens up with a description of the men in the courtroom and she's speaking as a journalist who has insider knowledge, almost like the author who knows everything. And she's saying how there's a man there basically who is sleeping with somebody who's not his wife in the hotel, and nevertheless he's on the prosecution team. She's going around like that. It's very polemic. It's very about going for the hypocrisy. It's taking this poor young woman, the way she's treated, and using it in the way that Émile Zola said j'accuse to French society. Yeah. And in that sense, I think it lasts and it stands up. And it is an amazing read still. And I think in generations to come it'll perhaps be seen as a book that is describing an Ireland that couldn't possibly exist, but nevertheless one that clearly does exist. But what's very important in that book is how, if you will, it's not just some standard feminist narrative, if you will, of a certain academic kind, but it's if you will, feminism from the point of view of what ordinary women are thinking, how ordinary women are revulsed by this, and how basically Irish public opinion is on the cusp of changing on an awful lot of things. So Irish opinion in the 1980s is going through an awful lot of changes, and in a sense we see this huge shift sociologically and socially in our society. And I think that book by Nell McCafferty captures so much of it. And it is a polemic, but then again polemics are also part of what we look at. Jonathan Swift's book's a polemic too.
Yes, I think I'd argue for that period as a cusp period in Irish society where all kinds of settlements set up in the 19th century or after independence suddenly became unstuck, or gradually became unstuck. I keep remembering, I have a vivid memory of the X case.
Yeah. When
the father of a little girl, or whatever age she was, 12 or 13 or 14, I don't know, sent her off to England to have an abortion. And William Binchy got on the box, and William Binchy seems to me to be a very nice man and a good man. And he had two propositions in his head, both of which are utterly true to him. One was abortion's always wrong. And secondly, Daddy has always the right to know what is best for his little girl. And he went around the two of them like that for about 20 minutes, and he could not put one ahead of the other. Yeah. It was quite extraordinary to watch him. He was trapped. I was actually sorry for him.
But sometimes Daddy is the problem, you know.
All right.
Right. Well, look, I think we've had great fun, great discussion.
Thank you very much,
I'm grateful to our two authors here this evening, because I think we could keep going for a lot longer, but I think we'll stop it when it's going very well. Thank you for being here. Thank Tom and Bryan for having made the book possible.
And thanks to Murray and Hodges Figgis for having us, I think.
Okay.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.